The Thames runs slow and grey this April afternoon. In 1536, carrying a covered barge toward the southeastern corner of the fortress. Inside, a prisoner sits in silence, feeling the rhythm of the oars. Through the gap in the canvas, he catches his first glimpse of what the condemned have seen for centuries: Traitor's Gate. The iron portcullis rises from the water like the teeth of some medieval beast, green with algae, where the tide marks its twice-daily rise and fall. The stonework around it is slick, perpetually damp, impossible to climb. This is the intake valve of the prison system, a water gate that cannot be blockaded by London's restless crowds, faster than any road through the city's tangled streets, and utterly unavoidable once the barge enters the channel. The architecture reveals its purpose in brutal simplicity. While the main gates face the city, subject to observation and potential riot, Traitor's Gate faces the river. Prisoners arrive unseen by the public, their humiliation reserved for the controlled spaces within. The iron rings set into the walls have held countless ropes, and the stone steps rise from the water at an angle calculated for both high and low tide. This is engineering in service of inevitability. The barge slides beneath the arch. The sound changes. Water slapping against enclosed stone, the creak of wood against iron. The portcullis descends behind him with the finality of a sentence pronounced. He has entered the machine. The prisoner steps onto the wharf, and the paradox reveals itself immediately. He is not descending into a dungeon. He is standing in a city. The outer ward stretches before him, 18 acres of organized chaos. To his left, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoes from the forge. The smell of baking bread drifts from the ovens near the Royal Mint, where silver pennies are being struck with the same methodical precision that governs every aspect of this place. Guards walk their circuits. Servants carry water. A raven picks at something in the courtyard. This is the genius of the concentric design. The fortress consists of 3 nested rings of defense: outer curtain wall, inner curtain wall, and the White Tower at the center. Each ring operates independently. The outer ward can mint the realm's currency, house the royal menagerie, and billet 500 soldiers while prisoners rot in the inner sanctum, completely unaware of the lions pacing in their cages just 200 yards away. The system is self-sustaining. Wells provide water. Storehouses hold grain enough to outlast a siege. The armory contains weapons for a small army. This isn't merely a prison. It's a military machine that happens to contain cells. A city fortress that can pivot from pageantry to punishment without missing a beat. The prisoner walks between these two realities. Bakers knead dough, while condemned men count their remaining hours. The same walls that display royal standards also bear the scorch marks of executions. The tower doesn't separate these functions, it integrates them, creating a space where normalcy and terror occupy the same ground. They lead him toward the inner ward now, passing beneath the bloody tower. Above him, the White Tower dominates the skyline like a fist of pale stone thrust into the London sky. William the Conqueror didn't build this structure to protect Londoners. He built it to crush them. Construction began in 1078, just 12 years after Hastings, and every dimension communicates the same message: Norman supremacy. The walls rise 90 feet from their foundation, 15 feet thick at the base, solid Kentish ragstone imported across the Channel, the same stone that built the abbeys of Normandy. This is colonization in architecture. The design is pure Norman brutalism. The walls present almost no openings at ground level, no windows for archers to target, no doors for rams to splinter. The few narrow slits that pierce the stone are positioned for defense, not for the comfort of those inside. The corners are reinforced with cream-coloured limestone from Caen, creating vertical stripes that draw the eye upward, making the tower appear even more massive than its actual dimensions. From street level, a medieval Londoner, Anglo-Saxon, conquered, resentful, would crane his neck and see nothing but looming stone. No decorative elements, no welcoming archways. Just the blunt fact of power, 90 feet of it visible from every corner of the city. The message was architectural. Rebellion ends here. The prisoner understands this now as the guards march him past. The White Tower isn't part of the prison system. It is the system, the central processor of a machine designed to remind England's nobility that royal favour is temporary, but royal stone is eternal. The door to the Beauchamp Tower cell closes. The lock turns, not with the dramatic clang of theatrical iron, but with the quiet, practiced click of a mechanism that has secured hundreds of prisoners before him. The candle gutters in the draught. The cell measures 12 feet by 8. A single window, barred and narrow, lets in the last grey light of evening. The floor is stone. The walls are stone. Everything is stone except the wooden bed frame and the bucket in the corner. But it's the walls that draw his attention. They are covered in messages from the dead. Here, carved with painstaking precision, is a family crest. The 5 wounds of Christ, rendered in intricate detail by someone who had months, perhaps years, to perfect the design. Below it, a line of Latin scripture, each letter carefully formed despite the crude tools available. On the opposite wall, a calendar of unknown purpose. Columns of marks tracking time in a place where time has ceased to have meaning. This is the torture method reserved for high-status prisoners. No rack, no thumbscrews, just time, endless, crushing, purposeless time. The tower's system recognized that noblemen couldn't be broken with common pain. Their bodies were protected by centuries of aristocratic privilege. But their minds could be shattered by removing the one thing that defined their existence: purpose. Outside these walls, they had commanded armies, managed estates, shaped policy. Inside, they have nothing but stone and darkness and the slow erosion of identity. The carvings are acts of desperate self-preservation, proof that they existed, that they possessed skill and learning and faith. Each carved rose and inscribed poem is a scream against erasure rendered in silence. The graffiti system served the tower's purposes perfectly. While the prisoners carved, they weren't plotting escape. While they prayed, they weren't rallying support. While they counted days, they were surrendering to the machine's fundamental truth. The tower doesn't rush. It simply waits. The stones are patient. The stones always win. The prisoner runs his fingers over a carved inscription dated 40 years earlier. The man who made these marks died here. Everyone knows it. The carvings remain, but the carver became nothing more than a name in the records, a property seized by the crown, a cautionary tale told in hushed voices at court. Dawn breaks over the Thames. The bell in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula tolls 6 times, the sound carrying across the inner ward and through the barred window. The prisoner wakes to another day of waiting. This is the machine's ultimate efficiency. It doesn't need spectacle. It doesn't require constant violence. It merely needs to be inevitable. The tower's power lies in its permanence. Monarchs die. Dynasties fall. Political alliances shift like the tide outside Traitor's Gate. But the stones remain. The same walls that held prisoners in 1100 still stand in 1536. The same gates that admitted traitors under the Plantagenets admit them under the Tudors. The system transcends any individual ruler because it is built into the foundation of royal power itself. Consider the arithmetic of terror. From 1100 to 1600, the tower held prisoners continuously. Some stayed for weeks. others for years. A few, like the princes in the tower, never left at all. But here's the crucial calculation. For every prisoner locked inside, 10,000 nobles walked free outside, constantly aware that their freedom depended on royal whim and tower stone. The machine didn't operate through the prisoners it held. It operated through the prisoners it could hold. Every English courtier who bowed before his monarch did so with the knowledge that Traitor's Gate waited in the Thames, that cells stood ready in the Beauchamp Tower, that the system required no justification beyond the sovereign's word. And the genius of the design is that it required minimal maintenance. No elaborate torture chambers to staff. No complex execution machinery to operate. Just guards, gates, and the slow passage of time. The tower converted royal displeasure into permanent detention with the efficiency of a well-designed mill wheel, grinding as long as the tide rose and fell. Outside, London grows. Merchants trade. Apprentices learn crafts. Life continues with the same indifference that the Thames shows to the prisoners who enter through its gate. The tower doesn't interrupt the city's rhythm. It sets it. The bells that ring the hours from the chapel serve both prayer and reminder. Time passes, stones endure, and the machine is always ready. The prisoner stands at his window, watching the morning light touch the White Tower's walls. Somewhere in the fortress, a guard changes shifts. A key turns. A door opens and closes. The machine performs its function, patient and precise. The portcullis may be raised today for tourists, their cameras clicking at the medieval walls and the crown jewels in their cases. But the stones remember the silence. They remember the scrape of desperate fingernails carving messages that would outlive their makers. They remember that power, at its most efficient, needs no defense but persistence. The tower taught England a lesson written in Kentish ragstone and Norman limestone. Rebellion is temporary, but consequences are architecture. I'm watching the past to understand the present. The gates are open now, but they remember how to close.